Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of YouTube videos to help you improve your chess game. On July 3rd this year, my friend Dr. John F. Bayley passed away. The cause of passing is not known, but John was not a young man. John was about 87 years old, so it may have been from natural causes. I wasn't able to see him in the retirement home because of the COVID restrictions. John was president of the Mainline Chess Club for more than a dozen years. And John and I would go out to lunch once a week and play golf. And I learned a tremendous amount from John. Not too much of it had to do with playing chess, but I thought I'd show some of the things that other people could learn from watching John's play. Now, John was only a weak player. He was like a 1300 player. And some of his misconceptions were very instructive, and I've used them in teaching over the years. So I don't want to talk too much about Dr. Bayley. I know people watching the video want to get better at chess. You know, Dr. Bayley was a physician, a pediatric physician. He worked for the CHOP, which is the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, for many, many years. And as I said, he was president of the Mainline Chess Club. He tried to bring the U.S. Championship to Philadelphia. He revived the Philadelphia Championship. He revived the Philadelphia Junior Invitational Championship. He just did a tremendous amount of stuff. He always wanted chess to be a high-level, very esteemed thing. He was always looking for sponsors to help bring in high-level play. He was interested in bringing Garry Kasparov to Philadelphia to talk. You know, those kind of things. All right, so let's learn something from John's games a little bit. This is a position that was similar to one that happened in John's game. I didn't write down when John actually played the game what the position was, but I remember that this was about the same kind of idea. So it's white to play, and as always when you're doing one of my videos and you see a position and you want to try it, you can simply pause the video, take as much time as you want to figure out what you would do and why, and then continue with the video. But I don't want to sit here for, 2-3 minutes of silence while you do it, so I'm just going to assume that you pause the video for as long as you need, and then I'll just continue with how the position went. Okay, so white to play. Well, I've given this position to several of my students, and they made the same mistake that Dr. Bayley made. They look at the position and they say, all right, I'm going to have to give up the rook for the pawn. But if I do, my king's going to come over and take off this pawn, and I should be able to win. So what they do is they play rook takes c3, king takes c3, king f5, king d4, king g6, king e5, king takes h6, and now king f6. White's only legal move is king h7, king f7. And now white has a choice of pushing the pawn or moving the king. Obviously, if he keeps moving the king and black keeps shadowing him, he can't get out. So let's say he pushes the pawn and black plays here. Now, if white continues to stay in the corner, black will continue to block him in until white finally decides to come out. And black now gets the famous draw where the king gets into the corner against the rook pawn, and white has his choice of draw by lack of mating material or stalemate. Okay, so what was wrong with that? Well, the problem is that you're not using white's tempos very wisely. It's true that the rook's going to have to sacrifice itself for the pawn sooner or later. And a lot of times in life, when you have to do things sooner or later, it's better off to just do them sooner and get it over with. But on the chessboard, that's not always true. On the chessboard, you could be losing time when you do that. So let's take the opposite approach of taking that pawn as soon as possible. Let's wait and take that pawn as late as possible. So let's say white plays king to f5, and black plays king to b2. And white says, I'm not even going to take the pawn now. I'm just going to play rook h1, get as far away from the king as possible. Black plays f2, white plays king g6. Black plays c1 queen. White plays rook takes c1. Black plays king takes c1. And white plays king takes h6. So we can see here that white is now about 4 tempos ahead of the other line that Dr. Bayley played. And white is winning quite easily here. Black obviously can't get back and stop the pawn. King d2, king g7, and the next 3 moves will be to get a queen. So what's the difference? Well, in this position, black immediately doesn't have to worry about trying to queen the pawn to win the rook. He's already won the rook, and his king's on the 3rd rank. And when white goes to the 5th rank, he can go to the 4th. When white goes to the 6th, he can go to the 5th. And when white stays on the 6th to take the pawn, you can go to the 6th and block him in and get the draw. On the other hand, if white immediately goes after this pawn with the king, there's a tempo. And when the king comes here, the king's going away from this pawn. He's coming down the board. Rook to h1. Pawn c2, king g6, pawn c1. And now the rook finally takes and the king takes. It's not so much that the king is 2 squares away from where he was before. That's helpful. But just the fact that white waited and made black make some moves so that gave him time to get the king up. In fact, we could have moved the white king even further away in that position and still won. If we started out with the white king on, let's say, g2, that may be enough here. Let's try it. King f3, king to b2, rook h1, c2, king f4, c1 queen, rook takes c1, king takes c1, king f5, king d2, king g6, king e3, king takes, king f4, and the king is 2 tempos away from stopping. So after the game, I asked John, I said, John, let me put the king back the way it was. I said, John, why did you take the pawn? And John said very logically, well, I had to take it sooner or later, so I figured I'd take it sooner. And that was kind of John. You know, he didn't really figure it out. He would just use kind of hand-waving. And he figured, well, if I had to take the pawn, what's wrong with taking it now? Why should I wait till later when maybe I'll forget or something? Now, it's true. There's other kinds of positions where you have to be careful. For instance, you know, if we give, like, both sides a knight here, and, in fact, let's put the black king on the other side. And now, if white comes up and black hits the rook and the rook comes back and the pawn comes up and white comes up, black might be able to play something like knight here now. And it's too late. You can't sacrifice your rook for the queen. If you take the knight, he gets a queen anyway. You can't play rook to f2. And he's going to get a queen. So in these kind of positions, you have to be very careful. But in the position that's in John's game, there's no knight to block the way. It's just a king, and a king can never block the rook. We had the king on b3. So, therefore, when white plays here and black plays here, you can just wait as long as possible. And that would be the rule in these kind of positions, where if you're going to give up the rook for the pawn, almost always you would wait till the last possible second. Rook to h1, pawn push, king up, and now he gets a queen, and now you've got to take it. But meanwhile, you've gained those tempos that you needed to come up and get the pawn. Okay, so that's something I learned, or that my students can learn from John. Let's talk about a game he played in one of our Holly Heisman Invitational tournaments, which we have every year to raise money for charity. And hopefully this year we can do it online, and a lot of the people watching this video can play and make donations for our charity. Okay, so number 45. So in this game, John was white, and he was playing a player a couple 100 points higher than he was in the Holly Heisman, and white's in big trouble. He's got one less pawn. His king is exposed. Black's got the bishop pair. Black's king is safer. In this position, it was black's move. And black, well, first of all, you can stop the video if you want and figure out what would you play here for black. So that's one thing you could stop and ask the video. But the second thing would be, I'm going to show you what black played, and I want you to figure out what you should do. So black in this position thought for a while, and he played queen to e2. So is that a good move? A bad move? a spectacular but unnecessary move? What kind of move is queen to e2? And again, you can stop the video, analyze as much as you want, try to figure it out. Well, in the game, Dr. Bayley looked at this and he said, uh-oh, my back rank is really weak. If I take that queen, he's going to come down and check me. So he thought for a little bit, and Dr. Bayley played bishop d2. Black saw that, was very happy, played queen takes d2 so the rook could no longer take the queen, and Black's now up a piece and he won the game easily. So after the game, I said to John, why didn't you take the queen? And John said, I would get checkmated on the back rank. And I said, okay, tell you what, you play black and I'll play, you play white and I'll play black, and I want you to show me how you're going to get checkmated. So John took the queen and I played rook checks, and I said, all right, now make a move that'll checkmate you. And John stared at the board for a while and kind of smiled like, I can't find a move that'll checkmate me. Well, there are moves that'll checkmate you in a couple moves. For instance, you could play knight e1, and when he doubles the rooks, you could just move your rook away from the knight, and then checkmate. Rook takes his checkmate. But that would take you kind of on purpose trying to play bad. So rook takes e2, rook e1 check. Now you should visualize this, of course, and not move the pieces around. In order to get better at visualization, you need to have to practice visualization. But this is a little bit too much to ask everybody to visualize. So rook takes, rook checks. So here, if you played rook to e1, that's not a really good move. Why not? Well, if you don't recognize this kind of position, this is basic tactics. The problem with playing rook e1 is what we would call removal of the guard. After rook e1, black can play bishop takes g2 check. And no matter how white gets out of check, black's going to play rook takes e1, and all of a sudden this game is getting a little more tense. So the best move here for white is not rook to e1 because of bishop takes g2 check, removing the guard. It's knight to e1. And now there's only one move for white that gives black a problem. Sorry, one move for black that gives white a problem. And that's to play another removal of the guard, bishop to f1. That kind of move is very easy to miss. Bishop to f1. And now the rook can't move because rook takes e1 threatens not only bishop h3 checkmate, but also bishop to like d3, discovering check, winning the queen. And all of a sudden there's some problems on the board. So here, the best thing to do for white is to try to save the rook. It's not that he has no other moves, but it's the best thing to do. He's got several queen moves that guard the rook. And the question is, which are the best? And a lot of people think that a move like queen f3 is the best. But actually, queen f3 is problematic. If you look a little bit further ahead, black can simply play e4, removing the guard of the queen on the rook. And the queen says, oh, I'm not so dumb. I'm going to come up here and play queen to g4. And now black plays the clever move g6, threatening h5. In fact, if white had played the worst move, queen h5, he would get g6 with tempo. And after queen g4, h5 completely removes the guard on the rook. But if he plays queen g4 right away, black should play g6. And now white's in a little bit of trouble because black's threatening h5. And the best white could probably do is something like h3 and try to get the king out of the trouble here. And white's got some problems here that he shouldn't have to run into. So what's wrong with playing the queen to the king side is these pawns can start to attack the queen and there's no way to guard the rook. So similarly, if white tries queen to c4, he's giving black ideas like playing b5. Now b5 here doesn't quite work because after queen takes c6, if black plays bishop e2, then queen takes a8 check, king h7, and now if worse comes to worse for white, he can just play h3 and give him the knight. So that doesn't quite work. But you get the idea that, maybe after pawn here, queen takes, maybe I could try to guard this pawn so the queen can't come back to c4, b6. And again, black's kind of threatening to take the rook and then take the knight. So it turns out, after queen e2, rook takes, rook d1 check, knight e1. Bishop f1, if you didn't see bishop f1, then you're kind of playing hope chess, because that's the only move that would give you a problem. White should play queen to c2. And now, white's in good shape. If bishop takes e2, queen takes e2. And if rook on 8 to d8, white can slowly unwind himself with a move like b3 and maybe bishop to b2. So black's losing in that case because he gave up a whole rook for nothing. Now, why did both sides make this mistake? Well, they kind of made the mistake by assuming that when the rook took the queen, that the pieces would explode and both pieces would go off the board. If queen to e2, rook takes e2, if black could magically recapture the rook and make it his move and get to this position where the rook exploded with the queen, well, okay, now there is a checkmate. Now rook to d1 check. Oh, we got to make it black's move. That would help. Now rook to d1 check. Knight to e1. Rook takes e1 checkmate. That's kind of the hallucinatory problem that both sides had. So if we go back to the original position, black to play, for some reason, black thought that if that rook came off the first rank, that it could no longer affect the first rank. And that's the problem. So actually what happened was when black played queen e2, I was watching the game, and I said to myself, what in the heck's that? And black all of a sudden realized his problem. And he looked up at me, who was one of the tournament directors, and he sort of did that don't tell him thing. Well, of course, when someone's playing a tournament, you can't communicate with them in any way. You can't smile, you can't give them a thumbs up, you can't talk to them. I mean, you can't do anything that would indicate what you know about the position. So he didn't have to tell me don't tell him. I mean, it would have been illegal for me to indicate in any way. I couldn't even make a face or anything. Like, if I made a face like, ooh, what an ugly move, and his opponent saw me, his opponent would all of a sudden realize, oh, this must have been a mistake. Dan's making an ugly face here. So, of course, I didn't do that. And unfortunately for Dr. Bayley, he didn't take the queen. I told Dr. Bayley after the game, I said, when somebody gives me a queen like this, I don't try to figure out why I can't take it. That's almost automatic. What I try to figure out is, how in the world could I possibly get away with taking it? I don't assume I can't take it. Obviously, if I'm playing the world's best computer and it never makes a mistake, and it makes a move like this, I'm pretty sure that I'm going to be in big trouble. But even when I'm playing humans that are decent, sometimes they make mistakes. And they make moves like this. And then there's a hole in their analysis, and you can take advantage of it and win. So you want to try to have that attitude that, boy, I would really like to take this queen. Is there any way I could possibly get away with it? And John's psychology was exactly the opposite. He was sort of like, oh, I can't take the queen. What should I do? If he would have taken the positive attitude of, let's see how I can get away with taking the queen, I think he might have done it. All right, let's do another problem another thing that we learned from John. Let's talk about his Jeremy Silman idea. Now, Jeremy Silman came up with this really great idea that when you have a plan, it has to be both feasible and effective. Feasible means you can do it, and effective means once you do it, it actually gets you somewhere. The problem with John a lot of times is he would come up with plans that might be feasible, and he could possibly get them, but they weren't effective, and those plans usually involve checkmate. So let's set up the start of the game. John loved to play for checkmate. He would set up every checkmate pattern that he could. So let's say he was playing the Cole system. d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, e3, e6, bishop d3, let's say bishop d6. And now John would think, oh boy, if he castles, maybe I can checkmate him on g7. So let's say John castles and black castles. Now he would start thinking, how do I get my rook up to g3 and my queen over to g5 or something? So, John might play knight e1, and you'd be like, what? And c5, and maybe he'd play c3, and knight c6, and now would come f4. And you'd be like, what's John trying to do? b6, rook f3, and you're like, well, okay, interesting. And let's, for the sake of argument, let's put his bishop back on e2 somehow. Bishop b7, bishop e2. We just want to make it more obvious that there's not going to be any mates here. Queen to e7, and maybe John would play, knight to d3, and I'm just making moves for black. Rook a c8, and now queen to e1, and I'm making moves for black. Let's see, what could he do? I'm just going to play rook f d8. And now he realized I can't play rook g3 because it would block my queen, so he'll play queen h4 first. And I'm just making moves again. And now he plays rook g3, and let's say b5, and John would go queen g5, threaten mate. And then black would play something like, oh, okay, I guess I can't get mated, knight to e8. And John would just stare at the board for a long time like, oh my goodness, he stopped my mate, and he's offering to trade queens, and what do I do now? He played the last 10 moves all setting up the checkmate while black was developing his pieces, and instead of doing what he should have done, like developing his queen side, he saw this checkmate and he went right for it. But there's a lot of principles that would have told him not to do that. For instance, world champion Steinitz said, you can't attack where you don't have the advantage. And white had no advantage on the king side, so there was no reason to think that he could checkmate black just by threatening a checkmate. So that was one of the problems. He didn't have an advantage, but he attacked there anyway. And as I said, he didn't really pay attention to Silman's rules, not that he understood them. But Silman had said, don't, if you have a plan, make sure it's feasible and effective. Well, we could see that this idea of playing rook g3 and queen g5 was actually barely feasible. I mean, I kind of let him do it. But once you did it, it's not effective. Once black stops the mate, why are you moving all your pieces to all these strange squares and neglecting developing the queen side? It doesn't make sense. So one of the things you can learn from John is that Silman's rules apply. In order to play a plan, it has to be feasible and effective. And also Steinitz's rules apply. You can't just attack just because you want to attack. You have to attack because you have some sort of advantage, either all over the board in terms of material or time or pawn structure or something, or maybe in one part of the board because you have more pieces in that part of the board than your opponent does. But you can't attack on the king side just because you would like to attack king side. The position has to call for it, and John didn't do that. Okay, so we have one more possibility for learning from John before we run out of time. And he was playing at a big tournament at the Adams Mark a few years ago, a big CCA event. It may have been the World Open. And he was playing in like the under, whatever it was, 1400 or 1200 section. And he reached an endgame where both sides had lots of time. And the position was something like this. I have no idea. I can't remember. White had a pawn here and a pawn here. And he had like a bishop. And maybe white had like 5 pawns. Maybe he had 6 pawns. And black had like 5 pawns. I don't know, something like this. So John was up a bishop and a pawn in a endgame here. And so I'm walking around the World Open and I'm watching my friends' games, I'm watching my students' games. And I look at this game and I say to myself, all right, if John was a stronger player, the other guy would have resigned. And I said, John's probably going to win, but, it's not 100%, but I'm going to go watch some of the other games. So I walked away for 20 to 30 minutes, and I came back, and John was putting his pieces in his very nice wood chess box that he made. John was an excellent woodworker, and he made lots of chess boxes for people to hold their chess sets. And he had a very nice wood-carved box, and he was putting the pieces away. And I went up, and normally I would assume that people won. But with John, I asked him, John, I said, how'd you do? And John said, he clasped his hand on my shoulder, and he said, Dan, you're a really nice guy, but you're a terrible chess coach. And I said, uh-oh, what's coming now? So I said, yeah. And John said, I was up a piece and a pawn in the endgame, and I lost. Well, I wasn't super surprised, but I wasn't too happy. And I said, "Can I see your score sheet, please?" So John gives me his score sheet. And I noticed right away that since I left 20 or 30 minutes ago, even though both sides were in the second time control for the World Open and they both had like an hour on the clock, that they had played 30 moves since I left in 20 or 30 minutes. What does that mean that they played 30 moves? Well, that means they're playing way too fast. Well, when you're dead lost like Black is in this position, then playing too fast doesn't mean that much because you're dead lost anyway. But when you're winning, you want to be careful. You don't want to play really fast. You want to play slow and careful. And when your opponent plays fast, you don't want to fall into the trap that a lot of low-rated players do of saying, well, he's playing fast and I'm winning, I'll just play fast. When you're winning, you have everything to lose, and he's got nothing to lose. So you should be taking your time. And John really didn't quite understand that. And John was playing fast too. So they played a whole bunch of moves since I left. The next thing I did was I counted how many king moves each side made since I left. Out of the 30 moves, 20 of the 30 moves that Black made were with the king. How many do you think John made with the king in those 30 moves? Well, the answer is 0. John's king never left the square it was on when I was back half an hour ago and 30 moves ago. His king was still on G1. Well, how much is a king worth? Well, the king has infinite trading value, but it doesn't have infinite fighting value. Its fighting value is about 4.25. Well, suppose you play an endgame with someone and you give them odds and you say, I'm going to play an endgame against you, but I'm never going to move my king. And the odds, what you're essentially doing is giving them 4.25 pawn odds. Well, how far ahead is white in this position? He's ahead a bishop and a pawn. A bishop's worth about 3.5. Pawn obviously is worth 1. So John's up 4.5. If he brings his king into the game, he's going to stay up 4.5. But suppose he never moves his king. Then he's down 4.25. Well, 4.5 minus 4.25 is very close to 0. So if you told me for the rest of the game, Black is going to use his king as much as possible and white's not allowed to move his king, and you asked me who I was going to bet on, and especially considering that both players aren't that good, I would say, well, the chances are about 50-50 because Black's got a king and a rook of fighting power, rook being about 5.25, king being about 4.25, and white's got a rook and a bishop of rook and a bishop and a pawn of extra fighting power. So he's got roughly the same amount of fighting power that Black has. So without the king, we have a fairly fair fight. Well, when you're up a bishop and a pawn, you don't want it to be a fair fight. You want it to be in your favor. So the fact that Black made 20 moves for the rest of the game, and poor John made 0 king moves, basically meant that he negated his bishop and pawn advantage, and it was kind of a flip of the coin as to who would win the game. So the only times you can play an endgame like this where you don't have to move the rook is if you're up a rook or more, which is more than 4.25. Well, maybe if you're up a rook, you could just move your extra rook around and still win the game without overusing the king. That's actually probably not the best way to do it. It's probably better to use your king. I'm just saying if you're not up a rook, then whatever you're up, if it's up 2 pawns or 3 or 4, if you're never going to move your king, it's going to be very, very difficult to win the game. You need that extra 4.25 worth of fighting power to win. All right, so we have 4 lessons from John. The first one was, don't take that pawn right away just because you have to. Sometimes waiting to the last possible second is the better way to do it in the endgame. The second thing was his game where he could have won the queen, and he just assumed it was going to be a back rank mate when it wasn't. He didn't optimistically say, how can I take that queen? The third one was John doesn't follow Silman's advice of waiting till things are feasible and effective to try them. Very often he would try plans that were simply feasible, but they weren't very effective. He could spend 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 tempos doing something, but then when he got there and his opponent would stop whatever he's trying to do, he would be stuck because his tempos would be basically wasted. And finally here, we see you have to move your king in the endgame. Your king is a fighting piece. And you also don't want to play fast just because your opponent plays fast. If your opponent's dead lost and he's playing fast, you can't say, well, this is an easy win, I'll just play fast too. Then you're falling right into his trap. You know, you're the one who has everything to lose. You're the one who has to be careful. He doesn't have to be careful. If he plays fast and does something crazy and just puts his rook on pre or something, he was going to lose anyway. So when your opponent plays fast, whether you're winning or losing, you should probably never be playing too fast anyway. Playing too fast, playing too slow, they're all not good. All right, so I'm going to miss you, John. I'm going to miss you, Dr. Bayley. Miss playing golf with you, miss visiting you. Been a long-time friend here on the main line. Mainline Chess Club owes you a big debt. And, you know, our condolences to your family. So, John, this one's for you. I hope some people watching the video appreciate you a little more, and maybe they learn a little bit from what we can all learn from our human frailty and mistakes. Thanks very much, everybody, for watching. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.